Imagine waking up to the global aviation community in shock as news breaks. Sweden has officially offered Canada 88 Gripen fighter jets, a deal so unexpected, so unusually generous, that analysts around the world begin asking the same question. Why? Why would Sweden, a country known for strict defense exports and careful diplomacy, suddenly put one of its most advanced combat aircraft on the table for a country like Canada, which has historically bought American equipment for decades? On the surface, it feels like a simple business deal. Canada needs jets, Sweden builds jets. But behind closed doors, this offer hides a story of geopolitics, military strategy, Arctic dominance, and the future of Western air power. And the real reason Sweden offered Canada 88 Gripens is far more shocking and far more strategic than anyone initially expected. It starts with a map. Look at the world from above, from the North Pole, and you'll notice something that most people ignore. Sweden and Canada are practically neighbors in the Arctic Circle. Both nations share extremely harsh climates, frozen landscapes, low population density, and enormous airspace that is constantly monitored by foreign powers, especially Russia. Sweden knows the Arctic is becoming the next global battlefield, and Canada, despite its huge territory, has been struggling to modernize its air defenses. Sweden watched Canada debate for almost a decade over what fighter jet to choose: F-35, F/A, 18 Super Hornet, even older upgraded fighters. Nothing seemed to move. Ottawa needed jets, but political pressure, budget issues, and American influence kept dragging the decision into endless loops. Sweden realized something important. Canada was reaching a point where it needed a partner, not just a supplier. So Sweden stepped in, but not with a normal sales pitch. Their offer was designed with one purpose: prove that the Gripen isn't just an aircraft, it's a solution. Sweden's defense officials quietly highlighted that the Gripen E is built for cold weather, rapid turnaround times, and short, icy runways. Exactly the kind of environment Canada faces every winter. But that was only the surface-level reasoning. The real plan was deeper. Sweden wanted to create a long-term strategic alliance across the Arctic. If Canada adopted the Gripen, both nations could share training, tactics, logistics, and surveillance across the Northern Hemisphere. Instead of dealing with the United States' expensive and highly controlled F-35 program, Canada would gain far more freedom. And Sweden would gain something priceless: a powerful ally with enormous territory that could help counterbalance growing Russian activity in the north. And it didn't stop there. Sweden also understood that the global fighter jet market was beginning to shift. More nations were looking for alternatives to the F-35, alternatives that cost less, require fewer restrictions, and offer more independence. If Sweden managed to get Canada, the world's second largest country by land area, into the Gripen family, it would instantly change the global perception of the jet. Overnight, Gripen would no longer be seen as a small Air Force aircraft. It would become mainstream. It would become a threat to American dominance in the global fighter export market. But to seal the deal, Sweden made one move that caught everyone off guard. They offered Canada unprecedented industrial cooperation. That included full technology transfer, local assembly, thousands of Canadian jobs, and long-term engineering partnerships. Something the US would never offer with the F-35. Why? Because America likes to keep its technology tightly controlled, while Sweden's philosophy is the opposite: shared development, shared capability, shared strength. However, Sweden's real motive goes even deeper than Arctic strategy or global market competition. Their intelligence agencies saw something alarming. Canada was slowly losing sovereignty over its own defense decisions, becoming almost fully dependent on American systems, American intelligence networks, and American defense approvals. For Sweden, this dependency was a problem, not for Canada, but for the balance of power in the region. An independent Canada means a stronger Arctic defense network. A dependent Canada means one less ally Sweden can rely on during a major crisis. So Sweden crafted the 88 Gripen offer as an escape hatch, a way for Canada to regain military independence without igniting political conflict with the US. And it almost worked. Canadian analysts publicly admitted that the Gripen met more of their requirements than the F-35. In fact, internal reports leaked later showed that the Gripen scored higher in several operational categories, especially cost, running hours, and cold weather performance. Sweden's offer wasn't just generous, it was smart, calculated, and strategically timed. But then, the story takes a darker turn. Pressure from outside powers, intense lobbying from US defense companies, and political maneuvering behind closed doors began to influence the process. Suddenly, the Gripen, despite scoring better on paper, was treated like an outsider. Sweden knew what was happening, but instead of withdrawing their offer, they pushed even harder, because the stakes were far greater than just a fighter jet deal. This wasn't about planes anymore. It was about control of the Arctic. It was about who gets to shape the future of Western air power. It was about two nations, one small, one massive, trying to break free from the gravitational pull of superpowers. And that brings us to the moment the world still debates today. Why 88? Why such a specific number? Why not 60 or 100? The reason behind that number reveals the true nature of Sweden's long game. The number 88 wasn't chosen randomly. It wasn't political. It wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. Sweden knew exactly what Canada needed, not just in terms of aircraft quantity, but in terms of operational capability across the entire Arctic region. To fully secure its northern skies, Canada requires a mix of patrol coverage, rapid intercept ability, round-the-clock readiness, and the ability to replace aging CF-18 squadrons without gaps. Internal Swedish analysts calculated that 88 Gripens would allow Canada to maintain continuous Arctic surveillance with enough backup jets for emergencies, training, and maintenance downtime. In simple terms, 88 was the perfect number to give Canada total air sovereignty. But this is where things get even more interesting. Sweden didn't just want to sell Canada planes, they wanted Canada to help shape the next decade of Gripen evolution. The Gripen E is already a powerful aircraft, advanced radar, low operating cost, electronic warfare that can blind enemy defenses. But Canada's geography and unique mission needs could push the aircraft into a new era of development. Sweden envisioned a Gripen North variant, optimized for Arctic missions, long-range patrols, and deep winter operations. If Canada joined the program, both countries would share research, share upgrades, and create the world's first next-generation Arctic fighter. It sounds ambitious, almost too ambitious, but Sweden was serious. They even offered Canada partial design influence and full maintenance autonomy. No foreign approval, no secret black boxes, no locked software. Total control, something unheard of in modern fighter deals. That freedom was one of the biggest reasons the United States became uncomfortable. A Canadian Gripen would mean Canada no longer needed American approval for upgrades, weapons integration, or mission planning. Washington saw the Gripen as a threat, not because it was better than the F-35 in every category, but because it gave countries too much independence. And independence in defense is something major powers don't like. Behind closed doors, U.S. defense lobbyists and political figures began quietly applying pressure. Meetings were held, promises were made, threats were hinted. Canada was reminded of shared defense agreements, NORAD commitments, intelligence cooperation, and the risks of diverging too far from the American defense ecosystem. It wasn't an open threat, but the message was clear. Staying aligned with the US would be beneficial. Sweden saw the battle shift. What began as a competition of technology had now become a competition of influence, and what Canada truly had to decide wasn't which jet could fly better, but which alliance vision they believed in. A future tied tightly to the United States, or a future where Canada stands more independently as a northern power. Inside the evaluation teams, a surprising truth emerged. The Gripen E was easier to operate, cheaper to fly, and better suited for Canada's environment. It could land on short, icy runways, disperse to remote locations, and even operate from highways. The F-35, while technologically advanced, required specialized maintenance, expensive hangars, and long turnaround times. Pilots and engineers quietly admitted the Gripen would save billions in long-term costs. But the decision was no longer just about aircraft performance. This is where Sweden played their boldest card. They offered to let Canada build the jets domestically, creating thousands of high-tech jobs. They offered full access to source code so Canada could customize the aircraft however it wanted. They proposed deep defense industrial integration between Saab and Canadian aerospace companies. They even offered training partnerships with Swedish Air Force units in remote Arctic zones, something no other country proposed. All this wasn't simply generosity, it was strategy. Sweden understood a basic truth. If the Gripen got even one Tier 1 Western partner, the entire global fighter market would tilt. Other nations, Finland, Brazil, Croatia, the Czech Republic, would see Canada's decision as validation, and suddenly, the Gripen would become the world's preferred independent fighter jet, a direct challenge to US dominance. Meanwhile, Canada's internal documents revealed something even more shocking. The proposed Canadian Gripens would be equipped with some of the most advanced electronic warfare systems on Earth, systems capable of jamming, deceiving, or blinding enemy radars across hundreds of kilometers. In Arctic conflict scenarios, this would give Canada unprecedented control over the electromagnetic spectrum. Sweden's long-term vision was clear: a Canada-Sweden Arctic shield with shared data links, shared satellite intelligence, and joint air patrols capable of countering Russian activity across half the northern hemisphere. A Scandinavian-North American alliance built not on size, but on innovation and independence. But the closer the deal seemed, the more resistance it faced. Some Canadian officials feared angering Washington. Others worried about interoperability. Some simply didn't want to break tradition. And all the while, Sweden watched quietly, knowing that if this deal failed, it would change the direction of the entire Arctic's future. And that's when the final twist entered the story. Information that few outside the defense world ever learned. Sweden had one more secret reason for offering Canada 88 Gripen jets, a reason tied to classified intelligence from the far north. Sweden's intelligence agencies had been tracking unusual patterns across the Arctic for years. Russian aircraft were flying closer to Canadian and Scandinavian airspace than ever before. Unknown radar signatures were appearing at high altitude near the North Pole, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, before vanishing. Surveillance satellites detected new Russian listening stations being built on remote islands in the Arctic Ocean. Something was shifting, and Sweden understood it before almost anyone else. The problem wasn't just Russian military flights, it was the speed at which the Arctic was militarizing quietly and rapidly. Melting ice was opening new sea routes, new trade lanes, and new resource-rich territories. Whoever controls the Arctic controls the future of global shipping, energy reserves, and early warning missile systems. Sweden realized that the world was approaching a new era of northern competition, and Canada, despite owning nearly half of the Arctic coastline, did not have the aircraft to protect it. This was the real reason Sweden offered 88 Gripens. The number wasn't symbolic, it was mathematical. Sweden had calculated the minimum number of fighters Canada would need to establish complete air dominance across its Arctic regions, even under worst-case scenarios. If tensions escalated, 60 jets wouldn't be enough, and 100 would be too expensive. But 88? That was perfect. Enough to guard the skies, rotate squadrons, train new pilots, and still have aircraft ready for emergencies. Sweden wasn't just offering planes, they were offering Canada a survival plan. Swedish analysts also realized that a future Arctic conflict wouldn't be fought like traditional wars. There would be no large dogfights, no massive bombing campaigns. Instead, it would be a war of sensors, stealth, electronic warfare, and long-range detection. And this is where the Gripen E shines. Its powerful EW suite can jam enemy radars from long distances. Its integrated data link can coordinate with drones, ships, and ground systems. Its small radar cross-section makes it hard to track. Sweden envisioned a Canadian Gripen fleet forming a digital shield across the north, an invisible net capable of detecting anything entering Canadian airspace long before it reached populated areas. But Sweden's calculation wasn't just strategic, it was also psychological. Canada had long been viewed by superpowers as a secondary player in defense politics, a country that purchased equipment rather than helping shape the future of warfare. Sweden wanted to change that. By bringing Canada into the Gripen program, they hoped to elevate Canada to the role of co-developer, not just customer. This meant shared innovations, shared testing, and shared future upgrades. A 20-year partnership rooted not in dependency, but parity. Behind the scenes, Swedish Air Force officers even prepared a classified joint training proposal. The plan included Arctic survival missions, extreme cold flight trials, night operations over frozen seas, and data fusion exercises between Canadian sensors and Swedish aircraft. If approved, these drills would have created the most advanced Arctic air defense cooperation in the world. Canada and Sweden would effectively become guardians of the Northern Hemisphere, a role neither had ever been offered before. But as all this unfolded, the geopolitical chessboard moved again. American officials, concerned about losing influence, increased diplomatic pressure. They emphasized the importance of interoperability with U.S. forces. They warned about delays in certification. They highlighted the risks of splitting from the NATO standard F-35 ecosystem. One by one, Canadian decision-makers began to feel the weight. The Gripen, despite being cheaper, simpler, and better suited for Canadian conditions, was being overshadowed by political gravity. Sweden sensed the shift. For the first time, they realized something. The battle for Canada wasn't technological at all. It was political, and politics was a battlefield the Gripen could not always win. But even then, Sweden did not withdraw. They pushed harder. They increased technology transfer offers. They expanded job guarantees. They committed to sharing sensitive Arctic intelligence. They even offered to let Canadian engineers modify and redesign certain Gripen systems, a level of trust the Americans would never grant. Sweden was fighting not just for a sale, but for an ally, for a partner, for a future in which smaller nations had more control over their defense decisions. The story ends not with a contract, but with a question that continues to echo through the defense world. What if Canada had said yes? What if Canada had chosen independence over influence? What if the Arctic shield envisioned by Sweden and Canada had become real? Analysts believe the world today would look very different. Canada would have one of the most agile and cost-effective air forces on Earth. The Gripen would have exploded in popularity across Europe, Asia, and South America. U.S. dominance in fighter exports would be significantly reduced, and the Arctic would have a powerful new alliance guarding its skies. But the most surprising truth is this: Sweden never made the offer because they needed Canada. They made it because they believed the future of northern security depended on it. They saw in Canada a partner with shared values, shared geography, and shared potential, someone who could stand beside them in the most remote and strategically important frontier on the planet. And that is the real reason Sweden offered Canada 88 Gripens. Not for money, not for politics, not for headlines, but for a vision of the Arctic's future. One where two nations could shape their destiny, protect their sovereignty, and redefine the balance of power in a part of the world that is rapidly becoming the most contested region on Earth. In the end, the offer became more than a fighter jet proposal. It became a symbol of what could have been, of what still might be, and of a future where nations choose independence, smart strategy, and cooperation over pressure and control. A future that Sweden still hopes Canada might someday embrace.